it should not be the job of a democratic state to start interfering in like the tasteless jokes people are making on WhatsApp or on Twitter. It's just like, that's why God invented the block button.
A lot of the anger around crime comes from the fact that there is a perception of asymmetrical policing, that the police is more politicized than they were in previous decades.
You get into the 1990s, you're able to buy a house in Brixton for 25p or whatever. And then now you're approaching retirement and that house is worth, £3 million.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price. Today I'm joined by our editorial director, Christian Niemietz, and our managing editor, Daniel Freeman. Now, we are in the depths of August here, a very hot August in Westminster, but there is still plenty on the agenda. The latest in the Broken Britain debate. Are we too slavishly focused on OBR forecasts and what the US thinks about our attitudes to free speech? Before we dive in, please do click subscribe below or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave comments on YouTube. We do try and read as many of them as possible. And subscribe to our Substack to get all of our content straight to your inbox. That's at insider.iea.org.uk. Now, without further ado, this week, the debate has continued to rage on a topic we've talked about a couple of times on this podcast. Is Britain really that broken? Christian, Fraser Nelson wrote a long essay in the Times, starting off looking at the crime question, because there's a lot of debate at the moment about whether crime really is falling. Lots of the sort of classic survey data that the government uses shows that it largely is historically, but that isn't exactly chiming with how people are feeling, and the likes of Nigel Farage and others are claiming that Britain is lawless, etc. What's your take on this?
Well, I saw the article before I saw the controversy around it, and at first I wouldn't have thought that this would be a controversial article. So the format is pretty much in the same style as something that we would publish, saying here's a public perception, here's what the data says. Surprise, surprise, public perceptions are often wrong. And that's basically what he does. He runs us through some survey data from the crime survey and corroborates that by comparing it to NHS data on hospitalizations for violent crimes and so forth. And says that, well, it broadly points in the same direction, which is that for the past 25 years or so, crime rates have been generally falling. Sometimes quite dramatically, sometimes only slightly, but pretty much across the board we see a decline in crime, and that's okay. That's good news. And then he became basically a Twitter meme after that. So I've seen, for example, one version of it where he is shown as comical Ali, the Iraqi propaganda minister, talking about how everything is going great while the Americans are invading already. Another one which shows him in front of this painting of the sacking of Rome by the barbarians and saying, oh, but statistically, actually, life is better than 10 years ago. I think his critics have massively overreacted. They're interpreting what he's saying in an extremely uncharitable way. So he is saying that crime is falling. He isn't therefore saying that we shouldn't take it seriously or that we should be complacent. He is certainly not telling crime victims that they should shut up and read statistics instead of going to the police or something. But nonetheless, it's an important point to make that things are not as bad as the public perception around it. And okay, my only criticism maybe of the article would be that it isn't the full story. There are lots of buts you can add to it and caveats and so forth. But nonetheless, even if you came up with a more pessimistic assessment than he does, you can do all that without denying the data or anything of that sort, which is what most of his critics have done, saying, well, surely these statistics are all fake and so forth, on fairly flimsy grounds. Because, okay, there may well be underreporting, but it's less about what exactly is the correct number for today. It's more about trends over time, and why would there have been less underreporting in 2000 or 2005? So surely this is more like, say, measures like fuel poverty, where you can say, well, the measure itself is not that meaningful, but nonetheless, whatever flaws it may have, these are constant over time, and therefore the time trend still tells us something, and this is something of that nature. So I think a lot of the anger around crime comes from the fact that there is a perception of asymmetrical policing, that the police is more politicized than they were in previous decades, and that would all be a fair criticism. That's something that you could say Fraser Nelson ideally should have addressed in his article. But nonetheless, the fact that you can say more doesn't invalidate his article. It just means this is one article. It's not a PhD dissertation on crime. There is more to say, sure, but none of that is incompatible with what he is saying. So I think the backlash that he has experienced over this massively overblown.
Yeah, I'd agree the backlash was grossly disproportionate. I mean, it's weird that over the last year or so, Fraser Nelson seems to have become like a lightning rod for a lot of like right-wing, like more radical elements of the right in Britain, in kind of the same way that like Matt Yglesias is a lightning rod for like left-wing Americans. Like, it doesn't really matter what he says. You're going to get in Yglesias's case, you're going to get like 1,000 DSA people being like, you're a fascist.
Yes.
And then in Britain, you get like thousands of fairly hard right people being like, oh, you're that dog in that meme where the whole house is on fire and you're saying this is fine. I'd agree. I don't think that's what Nelson is trying to get at in this article. I would say perhaps an interesting question is, why do people have this very strong perception that crime is increasing? And I think, which he doesn't really get into in a great amount of detail, there's some kind of hand-wringing about social media, but not much. And I think there is perhaps something to the idea that, you know, there are some crimes that are increasing. So, for example, and they tend to be very public crimes. So, for example, shoplifting. So a lot of the figures that Fraser Nelson was using were coming from the British Crime Survey, which is basically a survey of people. You ask a load of people, have you been the victim of a crime recently? And that doesn't factor in shoplifting or quite a few crimes against companies, because they are not people, they are not surveyed. But people still see people shoplifting, and that gives you a perception that like crime is not being controlled, because shoplifting has dramatically increased over the last 10 years. The same with things like phone theft. Yep. Like in London, I think theft from the person, which is generally sort of people snatching stuff out of your hand, has increased about 150%. In the last 10 years. So these are crimes that are sort of very, very visible, have a big impact on how you think about, you know, how safe is this area. And so people are sort of like seeing that. And also, I do think probably a significant role is actually the, you know, smartphones being ubiquitous now, because like 20 years ago, if you had someone on, like some man on the tube stripping naked and yelling profanities at strangers, you like, unless you happened to be on that tube train, you probably wouldn't know about it. Maybe you'd see a newspaper headline and you'd think, wow, that's a bit funny, if nothing else. But now there's a very, very good chance, like, even if you don't live in London, that you will have seen that on because someone will have videoed it and it will have done for the rounds on Twitter. And so I think that you feel it a lot more viscerally. And then there may also be something to the idea that like people today just spend less time in public, less time out in the streets, because, you know, people are working from home more. We're a generally older population than we were a few decades ago. People are spending more time at home at, you know, watching Netflix rather than out at pubs. You know, there's lots of data to back this up. And so even if crime in public remains constant or declines a bit, there's still a sense that like each time you go out, you may be more likely to be affected by it than you would have been like 30 or 40 years ago when you're just spending a lot more time in public.
I think that's right, actually. That's an interesting point. I think the visibility point here is the key, isn't it? And multiple governments have tried to wrestle with this, but that actually, yes, if our sort of serious violence rates are coming down, they're coming down over sort of period of decades, and things like county lines have been fairly bared down on, not entirely, but like there's been good progress and things like that. But these are sort of invisible crimes that you don't see. They're really, really high impact for the victims, for the people around them. But they are really, really invisible to so many people.
Yeah.
Then the shoplifting...
You're very, very unlikely to have ever seen a murder.
Yeah, exactly.
Even in cities that are much, much higher crime than London, have much more murders than London. Say like Washington DC, where you have about 25 times as many murders per head than London. Like the vast majority of people have never witnessed a murder. But so on some level, it's these sort of more low-level day-to-day crimes.
Exactly, and it's how much they matter, because it's also just it's not just the sort of seeing them on social media things. It's how is it impacting your life? And when I go to my local Tesco and I want to get some laundry detergent and I can't get it from the shelf, I've got to take a dummy copy to the till to get it from behind the till. Yeah, that sort of thing is okay. I've not been stabbed there, but that is a way that crime does just make your general day-to-day life feel a bit rubbish.
And that's also gets onto the point that some of the more sort of more intelligent critics of Fraser Nelson and this sort of crime is actually declining view is that part of this is just demographics, that as a country, the vast majority of crimes are carried out by young men. And if you have a smaller proportion of the population that are young people, if your population's getting older, you if the police did nothing, you would expect particularly violent crimes to come down over time. So that's one element, that it isn't the British state is great at dealing with crime. And another element is that when crime increases, particularly a lot of property crime, people modify their behavior in order to limit their exposure to crime. So an example is if shoplifting becomes really much more widespread, which it does seem to have become over the last decade or so, you have firms shops spending a lot more money on having a security guard outside, or as you said, there is not detergent on sale, you have to go behind the counter for this. Now, each individual move may not have, in itself may be a fairly insignificant thing, but I think it does add up, both economically in terms of all of those people who are now paid to stand outside as security for a Tesco Express could be doing, something more productive and useful with their lives if we had lower rates of shoplifting.
Yeah.
But also it has perfectly reasonable. It has an impact on how people think about crime, on how present crime is in their life, even if these measures mean that the overall rate comes down.
But to be fair to him, he says that himself. He says some types of crime have increased, and those are the more visible ones, the ones you are more likely to notice in public. And okay, in his article, it sounds a bit as if you were saying that it's irrational if you therefore feel that crime is going up. It's not necessarily irrational. It is just these are the things that you are more likely to experience and to see, and to emphasize those more, it's not necessarily irrational. A better criticism, something that he should maybe have said, but okay, I guess then it would have been a different article. A possible follow-up article could be, look, for, say, safety, technology reasons and the demographic reasons that you mentioned, we should actually have expected an even bigger drop in crime. So rather than saying, look, crime is at a 25-year low, hooray.
Yeah.
Why not say, well, for the technological reasons, for the demographic reasons, maybe other factors, we should have experienced a decrease in crime under any circumstances. And he says so that this is an international trend. This isn't limited to this country. And to the extent that we still have crime, well, some of it could be more easily prevented. So, but then again, this is all. This is an argument that you can make without claiming that crime is worse than it's ever been, and that's the problem. A lot of his critics are conflating that, and they have to frame it in catastrophic language, which you don't have to do.
Yeah, I think this is a real issue, particularly on some parts of the right in Britain. Like, it's not unique to the right. The hard left do it in different ways. He mentions, actually, when it comes to inequality, there's like this idea that inequality is worse than it has ever been, which is just the figures do not add up. But I think people often feel, if you say crime overall, particularly various types of violent crime, is less bad than it was 20 years ago, you are saying, oh, well, we should, abolish prisons, or we should just not care about this, or we shouldn't do anything to, like, get it even lower, which I absolutely don't think is the case. Like, on one level, you can say, well, 2005 is not necessarily the peak of human civilization in some ways. Like, yeah, in the 1980s and 1990s, we did have higher crime by a lot of measures than we do today. But if you go back further to the 50s or early 60s, we had significantly lower rates of crime than we do today. Even on crimes where, like, you do have pretty good measures, so things like murder or street robberies, muggings, like rates were much, much lower in the 50s or 30s than they are today. And so I think it's totally legitimate to say, like, we should do more. Like, it's perfectly fine. But I think what is totally reasonable from Nelson's piece is that, like, you do need to start from a position of seeing the world as it actually is. So you can't just start from a position of, like, saying it's the worst it's ever been because it feels like it is, even if the evidence just doesn't seem to match up with that.
Yeah, and in other areas, say if somebody said, look, cancer survival rates are improving, nobody would respond to that by saying, oh, so you're saying we should stop funding cancer research, we should defund the hospitals. Normally you wouldn't react in that way. You can point out a problem without claiming that it's the worst it's ever been. In fact, I've done this all the time when I've written about how bad NHS outcomes are. I've always said, nonetheless, this is better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Yeah. I recognize some improvement, but things are still bad, and that's a strong enough argument on its own. I don't need to claim that it's the worst it's ever been. I don't need to claim that it's getting worse every second, and that by the time you read it, it will probably be even worse than at the time when which I'm writing it.
But could it be better?
Yes, that's the kind of factual.
His main sort of the headline of his argument is that if you were to sort of from behind a veil of ignorance pick a time to live in the UK, you would probably pick today.
I slightly disagree with that. So
when would you pick?
Probably about 20 years. So probably like 1970-ish, thereabouts, because then you don't have, ridiculously high house prices. You get the advantage of sort of buying property before the big explosion in house prices, so which has locked a lot of young people out of the prospect of home ownership. So yeah, I wouldn't agree with him on that.
So home ownership is somewhere where we would say this is the worst it's ever been.
Yeah, but well,
and I don't think he would disagree with that.
No.
Yeah, but also actually, this is one area where I think, by a lot of measures, the last, ironically, actually not so much crime on the whole, but by a lot of economic measures, the last 20-ish years have been really, really bad for Britain in terms of just economic stagnation. Actually, he does bring this up in the piece that wages in real terms haven't really grown very much in the last 20 years. And
so would you pick 1970 even considering all the other things? So we'll go down a bit of a rabbit hole here. We need to move on, but even considering sort of 3-day a week.
Well, no.
When you have inflation coming.
No, I'm not saying I would really like to be an adult in the 1970s. No, that's a terrible pick.
But being born in
if
1970.
the question of being born, being born, yeah. So I'd be like, being born as a sort of late boomer is like sort of some point in the late 60s. You've like really, really lucked out.
So you're buying a house in the early 90s.
Yeah, you're buying a house. You're at the peak of this demographic boom. So there are loads and loads of young people to pay for a relatively small number of pensions because there aren't as many old people. So you have much, much lower taxes than you would otherwise have. And then as you're becoming an adult, you're in the sort of 80s boom. And then you get into the 1990s, you're able to buy a house in Brixton for 25p or whatever. And then now you're approaching retirement and that house is worth, £3 million.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
And you get to be in the 90s in your 20s.
And now you get massive pension.
Just very quickly before we move on, when would you pick?
But if I travel back in time, can I bring my knowledge of today with me so that I can buy Microsoft shares and houses in Britain? Is that?
Yeah, why not?
Well, then
cheating. That's cheating because that.
Okay, we do need to move on to our next topic. There's been a really interesting piece that Stephen Bush wrote in the Financial Times, sort of partly lamenting the outfall from the Truss period for various reasons. But one of the points he really talks about and focuses on is our attitudes to the OBR and the forecasts and sort of independent bodies that constrain or restrict or that we pay too much adherence to in formulating economic policy. Dan, what was the argument and what's your take?
Yeah. So, as you say, it was an interesting piece by Stephen Bush because it was kind of justifiably laying into Liz Truss, but for slightly different reasons than usual, in that one of the issues that she had is that she did have a couple of good ideas, but was so politically disastrous that they've, for the time being, been somewhat discredited. So the first one he brings up, as you mentioned, is the idea that it has solidified the role of the OBR as basically the sort of supreme arbiter of long-term fiscal policy in the UK. And he's very much in his piece not saying the OBR is terrible and should be abolished. It has a lot of merits in that, their degree of distance and independence from the government mean that their sort of growth projections are, there's less tension there than previous projections that all came out of the Treasury. But he's basically saying that, like, fiscal policy is to some large degree, an ideological question. And you do need to allow governments to use judgment, to like have their own view about the effects of, say, tax cuts or spending increases in infrastructure. And he gives the example of, Norman Lamont in the early 1990s, who was, the Treasury orthodoxy was that any tax cuts he engaged in would not lead to greater growth. That turned out to not be true, and we got more growth. So basically, the argument is that the OBR is important, but you shouldn't sort of deify it in a slightly weird way. The other point he makes, which I also think is a very good one, is the idea that tax policy and fiscal policy in the UK has become far too obsessed with the idea of being like every measure must be progressive, fair, must have like a good distributional impact. So that any tax changes that seem to kind of benefit people on average who are wealthier is seen as like, oh well, you couldn't possibly do that, even though it creates a lot of distortions in the British tax regime. So you've obviously got big examples like the major cliff edge you hit when one parent earns £100,000 because it means you lose any childcare entitlement. So if you were to reform that, it would be, the Resolution Foundation, I'm sure, would come out with a really great graph about how this is a regressive tax change, but it would be a very, very sensible tax change because you do not want to discourage people who are high earners from working if they want to, but because of this sort of orthodoxy that's existed for the last 15 years, we've kind of become overly focused on like how progressive every single tax is.
Yeah, I agree with the broad sentiment of his article, but I think he's over-egging it. So firstly, after the last autumn statement, there was an OBR report which was fairly critical of it. So they didn't explicitly say the autumn statement, the fiscal statement is rubbish and the government should resign or anything, but all the numbers were negative. And this was clearly an implied criticism. Nonetheless, the government didn't, on that basis, correct their course and dramatically change their policy. So it's not really that OBR modeling drives policy. It has a big impact on reporting on it, and fair enough. But I think he's over-egging the pudding that fiscal policy, the claim that fiscal policy has been outsourced to the OBR is too strong. And governments can and do enact policies that the OBR disapproves of, and where the modeling shows you probably shouldn't do this, and on a discretionary basis, they can still do that. They just need an extra justification, and it creates the OBR modeling creates a baseline. So you can say, okay, the impact of this is clearly it does mean probably more borrowing or some other negative outcome. As a politician, you then have to say, but I think it's justifiable on other grounds. You can still do that. What you can't do, I mean, you can legally, but it's going to be held against you. What you shouldn't do is to just dismiss OBR modeling that you don't like and say, oh, well, this is all rubbish. I just have a feeling that my tax policies will be absolutely brilliant, and the OBR are just too stupid to pick that up in their modeling. Okay, if you do that, it's not going to go down well. But to say that the OBR has too much power, I don't really see that. So we don't see policy changes directly driven in response to them, and or even to the extent that we do. Say maybe with the attempted reforms of disability benefits. Well, okay, there you could say, yes, okay, that this was clearly in response to OBR reports showing that there's something going wrong here. But if the OBR didn't exist, surely there would have been some forecast, be it from the Institute for Fiscal Studies or somebody else, saying, look, the number of disability benefits claimants has gone up massively by, I think, over 1 million compared to before the pandemic. Surely that's going to have some impact on public finances. And if this isn't driven by a massive deterioration in the health of the working age population, then surely something is going wrong here. Even if you don't have an institute like the OBR, there would be, even under any circumstances, we would figure out that something's going wrong here, and we should. Okay, ideally, you shouldn't need a fiscal forecast. It should just be, even if, say, this had happened at a time when tax revenue was rising for some other reason, and we can afford spending a lot more on these programs. Okay, but maybe we shouldn't do it if there's no obvious reason why claimant numbers should go up. Then if there is this increase and we don't have an obvious explanation for why that is, that should indicate that there's a problem there. And on the the second point, we've said this many times in this podcast that we have this resolution foundation mindset. Everything must be progressive, and if somebody publishes a graph saying the top decile is going to benefit slightly more than the bottom decile from something, that is immediately going to be held against any policy measure, whatever it is. But here, I think the resolution foundation has more to answer for than the OBR.
Well, I'd say, yeah, I think that's a very fair point, is that, and I don't think Stephen Bush's argument is that this is the OBR's fault. I think the issue is sort of a lot of British politicians, and it's not just in the government, but other parties kind of have, well, especially when they get into government, kind of have this sort of learned helplessness where they're in some ways actually keen keen to sort of say, oh, well, we're forced into this. We don't have a choice. It's not a political decision. We've just decided. And it's like, you do certainly have constraints. And yeah, if you are committing to spending more, and the OBR, as they repeatedly warned, is you'll end up getting a fiscal black hole that is going to cause you problems. But even with this government, when it's something that they're really committed to, like the employment rights bill, which I think, according to actually, that may not be the OBR's estimate, but internal estimates suggest that's going to cost British business about £5 billion a year. Like, you could say, well, we have no choice, we must abandon it. That would be pretty good. But because they are very committed to it, it seems like, that is going to, be pushed through.
And they also constantly are saying that the really long-term projection, sort of 50-year projection, the debt to GDP ratio is going to be ridiculously unsustainable. And those long-term, the OBR thing doesn't tie the hands of the government in the long term in any way. Nobody ever really pays any attention to those numbers. They think about their own fiscal rules and the sort of 5-year forecast and what will happen at the end of the Parliament or whatever. But the OBR is also standing there screaming, saying this is going to be a really huge problem in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and doesn't really have the effect that we might hope.
Yeah, I think that's partly just the assumption that someone else will solve.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
some, I'll be writing my memoirs. Is the kind of attitude.
I'll be on the speaking.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, but all it does is the effect is that at a press conference, a critical journalist will be able to have a number that they can quote and hold against the government. And they will not be able to say, well, the number is rubbish. But nonetheless, what they can do is simply wiggle out and say, oh, yeah, we'll solve that later.
Now, before we end up, we want to speak about free speech. So this week, the US State Department has published one of its reports into sort of human rights in other countries, which it does on an annual basis. And in the chapter, the section about the United Kingdom, it says that human rights over the last year have gotten worse because of restrictions on free speech. It references the Online Safety Act, it references our strict contempt of court laws, it references safe access zones outside abortion centres, and the authorities' response to the Southport riots and sort of the CPS and the police clamping down on spreading of hate and misinformation, etc., etc. Christian, what's your take? Does the UK have a serious problem with free speech to the extent where it should be being reported in the United States Human Rights Report?
I can't see why it shouldn't. Yes, I mean, this is clearly true. And the fact that the US may be in some ways a worse offender doesn't make that wrong. So if somebody criticizes you and if the critic is a hypocrite and doesn't practice what they preach, well, their criticism of you can still be correct. And this is also something that we've talked about here many, many times. So we have quite explicit a politicization of the criminal justice system going on with, I think, according to the figures from the Free Speech Union, they say something like 30 people per day get arrested for tweets. So it's partly clearly in the law and the way it's enforced, but also just the more accidental responses. And here the online safety bill comes in, where even though some politicians are trying to defend it, saying, "Oh no, this is not going to limit free speech in any way. It just means it just imposes a duty on companies to remove illegal content and so forth." But we've talked about this. The way it's going to be enforced in practice is just that online platforms are going to be hyper cautious, thinking one false negative can bankrupt and ruin me. A few false positives, taking things down that are actually perfectly legal. Well, doesn't cost me anything. I'll just do it. I'll take everything down. And that's the way it's going to work out in practice, even if that isn't the intention. So it clearly is true. There is a free speech issue. And what's, I guess, part of the problem is that this becomes self-reinforcing, right? When you have... so a couple of years ago, there were more people on the political right who were willing to defend freedom of speech, and in I think a fairly principled way, who would have defended the freedom of speech of people they hate, who would have been prepared to do that. Now I see fewer people being willing to do that, to argue from first principles, because there are too many people who want revenge. That's why when you have a case like this court case against the group Kneecap, that you see right-wingers feeling, okay, finally we get a chance to have a go at people that we hate. It's no longer always us who are at the receiving end of it. Finally, these bastards are getting a taste of their own medicine. And okay, I can understand the impulse, the vindictiveness, but nonetheless, you should be able to take a step back from that and say, well, okay, but from first principles, irrespective of what I think of the band, and you'll probably guess what I think about that. But nonetheless, I mean, yes, okay. The allegation was that the guy was, I think, waving a Hezbollah flag or something, which technically, yes, they are a proscribed terrorist organization. But surely this is a case where you don't have to take it absolutely literally. You can see them as a bunch of kids trying to be edgy. Is this really any different from, say, somebody, some musician in the 1980s saying something pro-IRA, where you can think, well, okay, this is a musician who wants to be edgy, wants to be a bit Marilyn Manson-like and whatever, and just let them do it, and who cares? And free speech issues, you get a self-reinforcing spiral, that if you have people feeling, okay, the authorities had a go at someone on my side, now I want to lash out against the other side, and I'm not prepared to argue from first principles here, then the culture of free speech gets lost, and then there's no chance of improvement.
I would agree with the vast majority of that. I think... I mean, this is actually an example of an area where we actually have got worse. Like, I think it is notable that, like, as you point out in figures from the Free Speech Union that they collected with the Times, in 2023 there were 12,000 people arrested for online speech, primarily under Section 127 of the Communication Act, which deals with grossly offensive speech. And I think part of the reason why there hasn't been like more of a political backlash against this in this country is, okay, partly a lot of the public are just not particularly libertarian when it comes to freedom of expression. That's one part of it. But also, I think there's just a very limited understanding of just how authoritarian British speech laws are when it comes to online speech in particular. So the standard in the Communications Act of 2003 was it is an offence to send a message that is grossly offensive, or to communicate anything grossly offensive online, regardless of whether anyone who actually sees this is grossly offended. So this has included things like people in private WhatsApp groups, groups of like a dozen-ish people exchanging like, tasteless jokes, and them all being prosecuted under this because someone was being prosecuted for someone else. The police looked at their phone and then it spiraled out of hand. You get an example of there was an 18-year-old woman in Liverpool a couple of years ago who had a friend who died. One of their friends' sort of favorite songs was like by some rapper. She posted the lyrics of this song, which included quite a few N-words. Someone then reported her because you've sent an offensive message, even though everyone accepted there was no intent to be grossly offensive. I think that girl ended up getting a community order. And yeah, there's just an awful lot of people who are getting swept up in this. And, well, aside from any principle point, there's also the argument is, like, this is not a very good use of police time. It's not a good use of court time. I would say...
Spaces.
Yeah, I would say if you're sort of kind of on the left, perhaps one of the more sympathetic arguments is this isn't exactly speech. It's more how counterterrorism law is enforced. But the reaction to people saying they support Palestine action. Mm-hmm. Currently you have 700 people facing prosecution on terrorism charges simply for saying, I oppose, or writing, I oppose genocide, I support Palestine action. And it's just like, there are lots of crimes that the police and courts could be spending their time on.
That's disgusting.
Police and courts are constantly complaining about lack of resources. Well, here's a pretty obvious area where you can reduce the burden, because it's simply not, it should not be the job of a democratic state to start interfering in like the tasteless jokes people are making on WhatsApp or on Twitter. It's just like, that's why God invented the block button. That's not that, you shouldn't be prosecuting.
Entirely agree. I think, just to wrap up, I think that this is a really good example of what happens when there is a general either a forgetfulness or a complacency about sort of protecting core principles like this. And we've seen each infringement on free speech in the UK was come about because of from well-meaning intentions, right? Even safe access zones around abortion clinics and stuff. All these all individually seem like good ideas, but when you put them all together, and you don't have someone at the helm saying free speech is important, which frankly I don't think the Prime Minister is really doing. Every time he's sort of challenged on it, his default line is, We've had free speech in the UK for a long time, and we always will, and then they move swiftly on. But the police, and thinking about the sort of response to Southport, etc., the police, well, they're operationally independent and they enforce the law, but actually they will take a steer from the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary. And if the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary stood up and said, actually, we really care about free speech, this really matters, we want you to focus on policing the streets more than the tweets, etc., etc., and made a bit of a posture about that, then that would have a bit of an effect. It's not quite the same as changing the law, so it's less authoritarian, but those sorts of things do matter. And I think that without that, you do have this slow slide into a slightly more authoritarian state. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for, but thank you very much for joining us. We'll put all the links for the stories we discussed today in the description below. As mentioned, do click subscribe, click like, and leave a comment. We will read them all. And until next week, thank you very much.